We have with us right now Ollie Vargas. He is a reporter in Bolivia with Kawsachun News. Ollie, how long have you been reporting in Bolivia?
Well, I came just after the coup took place in November last year. I arrived, I think, early December, when Evo Morales' party, the movement towards socialism, was beginning to regroup, sort of reorientate itself after the quite traumatic events that took place in November last year. And I've been following that process since then, really, and is a process that's still ongoing now.
And that's what we wanted to talk to you about mostly. We're talking to Linda Farthing about some of the history of the Morales government, but we were interested in talking to you specifically about the events leading up to last year's election, the fraud allegations, and the removal of Morales from power. Can you talk to us about that? What was happening in the around last year's election, and what were some of the allegations, and what has been kind of the result of those allegations?
Well, Evo Morales has won every presidential election that he stood in since 2005. So he'd won already 3 presidential elections. His last victory was in 2014, where he won with over 60% of the vote. And he was standing for the 4th re-election in October of last year. Now, the minority of the country that always opposed the MAS had grown increasingly desperate, and they saw no sort of exit from what was very clearly going to be a victory for the MAS. So before the elections, we begin to see a number of mobilizations, number of allegations that his candidacy is illegitimate and that there will be fraud in the elections. This is before any vote had been cast. The elections come and Morales wins with just over 10%. And in Bolivia's electoral law, you can win in the first round if you have more than 10% than the second place. So Evo didn't manage to reach 50%, he got 47%, but it was 10 points above second place than sort of neoliberal centrist candidate Carlos Mesa. So what we see then is Carlos Mesa calls his supporters out. He makes sort of these allegations of electoral fraud, very similar to what Donald Trump has been talking about in the past week or so. So allegations without much basis, but calling his supporters out to the streets while vote counting was still going on. And what did his supporters do the night after the election? They went out and they burnt down vote counting centers, held violent protests in the cities of Potosí, Sucre, and also Tarija, I believe. So in 3 main cities, these protests turned violent. They burned down vote counting centers. That's something that presents a problem for doing a proper audit of the elections, because even during this sort of melee, ballot papers end up getting burned, end up getting destroyed by these sort of violent right-wing groups. And then we just see the situation get worse and worse. The violence escalates dramatically from the right-wing opposition. Figures from the US, such as Marco Rubio, sort of start tweeting that electoral fraud is taking place. Again, this is while vote counting is still ongoing, and they don't provide any evidence for these allegations. They make these sort of communications that further inflame the situation in Bolivia. And then what we see is these right-wing protests, these anti-Evo Morales protests, turn increasingly violent. They start burning down the homes of prominent leftists, as they did with the MAS governor of Oruro, with a number of key ministers of Evo Morales. There was the story that went around the world, I remember at the time, of these right-wing protesters kidnapping and torturing a left-wing mayor in the town of Vinto. Her name was Patricia Arce. And the situation in the country became incredibly chaotic, and the government wasn't able to get a handle on these protests, which were taking place in the big urban centers of the country, mostly the middle-class sections of the big cities. These protests did not take place in the country's rural areas, which are overwhelmingly indigenous. These protests did not take place in the working-class areas of the big cities, such as the city of El Alto, the south of Cochabamba, the area of Plan 3000 in Santa Cruz. That's not where these protests took place. These protests took place in areas such as the south of La Paz, which is the wealthiest area of the city, the north of Cochabamba, again, the wealthiest area of the city, and the inner zones of the city of Santa Cruz. So what we see is a middle-class uprising, rebellion against someone who they see as their inferior. Their discourse against Evo Morales has long been that he's not someone who's fit to lead the country because he's not someone who went to university. He's a simple person. He's indigenous. And the state should be run by people like them. People who are middle, upper class, people who've studied abroad in the United States. So there was a heavy class resentment, a heavy racial resentment against the idea that they're being governed by someone who should be their servant or should be their, their inferior. So I think all of that came to a head in October last year.
Ollie, I think it's important because to go back one space, because most of the people that's going to be listening to our show, while they understand neoliberal very well and they understand the working class very well, can you break the what you would term neoliberal down by socio-economical status? Because for us, what we see with Trump is we have a very large support coming from the blue collar workers, most of which you would consider indigenous people. What we look at as blue collar, very I'm trying to find a word that's not degrading, but there is no word that's not degrading. The fact is they're very lowly people that work mundane 7 to 3:30 jobs, many of them in, very underpaid, but in other words, what I'm trying to do is focus where the support for the support you would see for Evo Morales would be coming from the very lowly working class of Bolivia, is the exact same support we see in America coming from the working class for Trump. And so there's a very big disconnect in that dynamic between Bolivia and America. So could you explain the socioeconomic breakdown of these people? You said the neoliberals burned down these voting booths, and the neoliberals that you're considering in Bolivia is actually our working class in America, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge number of differences because something that happens in the United States as well in the UK, I think, is that the sort of mainstream sections of the left have failed to really engage and incorporate the working class into its political base, where it maybe used to have those sections of society within its party. It's since lost them for many years. However, in Bolivia, the process has been the reverse. In fact, in Bolivia, Evo Morales, during the 90s and early 2000s, created his party. It's called the Movement Towards Socialism. And what that party was, it wasn't a traditional party that you join as an individual. What it was a coalition of different working class movements, as well as rural indigenous movements, welding them together into a political organization on the basis of anti-capitalism, of nationalizing the country's natural resources and big industries and using them to mobilizing those resources to create sort of state development, raise people's living standards, and also on a program of racial equality. The majority of Bolivia is indigenous, is not white, and switching the power base in that country from a white minority, descendants from the Spanish, into the indigenous majority was incredibly important during Evo Morales' government. So Bolivian politics is split along class lines. On the one hand, you have Evo Morales and the Bolivian left, which has brought together a wide coalition of different forces from below. Not just the working class in the urban areas, also the working class in the rural areas, small traders, small business people, those sorts of groups. And then on the other hand, you have the country's right-wing parties, neoliberal parties, who call for the privatization of natural resources, the privatization of big industries. But who are those people? What class do they come from? They're people who are overwhelmingly educated in the United States, not in Bolivia, and who look to the United States as a political economic model to follow. So those are the kind of cultural and economic class divides that exist in Bolivia.
Yeah, I want to kind of like tie in a little bit to what David was saying, you know, because it's interesting, especially here in Alabama, people who make less than $50,000 a year in Alabama voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. And every Alabamian knows like a sweet old lady who's, you know, working class, certainly not wealthy, who will just say in like this sweet voice, you know, oh, I thank God for President Trump. I thank God for freedom. I thank God for America. And we spoke to a unionist in the cocoa growers union just yesterday. She'd been in the union for 30 years, and you know, you can tell like that's kind of a similar, she's got a kind of a similar background to these like older women in Alabama, you know, just humble, working class, rural, and in the same, I mean, like I could hear my grandmother saying it in the same voice. She said, you know, oh, I thank God for socialism, and I thank God for President Morales, and I thank God for President Arce, and it was amazing because she's
the
like
disconnect.
She's literally the same person that I know in Alabama saying the opposite thing, and it's amazing how ineffective, like you said, the left has been, quote unquote, in America to tie their material concerns to an electoral project or a movement project, and it's been much more effective as we can see in Bolivia.
And the fact that what Ollie refers to as neoliberals, we refer to, yes, there are some on not the left per se, but the left of center. We consider, you know, the Democratic Party and the neoliberals, but mainly on the right of center that are actively exploiting these same people that we're talking about in Alabama. And they're thanking them for it.
Yeah, and so Ollie, you know, you were talking about the coup, and we wanted to kind of pull out those threads, and I wanted to underscore a couple other important points. Like, it wasn't just U.S. politicians that were making these unfounded allegations of voter fraud. It was the Organization of American States sent out letters. The New York Times, you know, echoed these allegations, and since then, the Organization for American States, the OAS, the New York Times, they have all admitted that the allegations of voter fraud were unfounded, that these were not, that there was no documented evidence of any fraud by the MAS, and what ultimately ended up happening is that the military sent a letter to President Morales recommending that he leave office, right? And so pick us up there. What happens? You know, what happens when the democratically elected leader of Bolivia is forced
out
to
of his
resign.
country.
Yeah,
Not just resign, but forced out of his own country.
A warrant was put out for his arrest.
Exactly.
So we're jumping the gun a little bit, but what happens? What happened from when he resigns?
Well, the country falls apart in a number of ways. I think in the United States, Europe, there's a certain discourse that, socialism in Latin America has caused like total breakdown of society, and we mustn't follow that path. In fact, what happened in Bolivia was the reverse, is that 14 years of Evo Morales' government had provided Bolivia with the longest period of economic growth and of social stability. The moment Evo Morales left office, all of that broke down once the sort of pro-United States candidates came into power. So what we first saw was huge political repression. There was 2 massacres of pro-Evo Morales protesters in the first 10 days after the coup. But following that, there was also an incredibly serious economic crisis. For the past year, what they've done is begin to sort of paralyze the big state development projects in favor of sort of free market-based private initiatives. They've cut public spending. Was an economic recession before the coronavirus hit. We're already seeing rising unemployment and economic slowdown before that hit. There's a number of big projects under Evo Morales, which are led by the state, which are paralyzed, such as the lithium processing plants. Bolivia has huge lithium supplies, and the idea of Evo Morales was to have the state control that process of extraction and of processing it, turning it into batteries, etc. Doing that within Bolivia, not just exporting a raw material to a country like the United States, and for them to do the work of processing it and selling the finished product. What Bolivia was doing is making the finished product within the country. And the only way to do that was with state investment, with state ownership. That was paralyzed after the coup took place. The factory gates were closed. The same took place just near here. There was in the Tropic of Cochabamba, there was a factory producing fertilizer. It was one of the biggest in the region under state control. That was closed down. A number of big state transport projects also closed down. Part of the general program of austerity and cutting public spending. So we see an economic slowdown, and then the pandemic hits. And what the government's response is to declare an immediate sort of lockdown, total lockdown, but without any kind of plan for how to help the majority of the population who works in the informal economy and who suddenly lost their income when the lockdown was declared. So people were locked away, and there was no such thing as furlough pay or subsidy checks. People were left to starve in huge numbers. And during that period, we saw unemployment triple, because what happens when people suddenly lose their incomes and have nothing to replace it? Consumer demand collapses. What happens after that? Well, small businesses across the board collapse. They no longer have customers. And since then, unemployment has more than tripled, and there's now a total economic crisis. The economy contracted 11% in that time. So that whole neoliberal approach, free market approach that was immediately implemented after Evo Morales was forced out of power, that triggered a very serious economic crisis. And that's part of the reason that the MAS was able to win later on. Because for 14 years under Evo Morales' government, the argument from the left was always that if the right take over, if the neoliberals take over, then you're going to be hungry, there's going to be total disarray. And I think that argument worked for a long time, but after 14 years, it's a long time, it's more than a decade, people began to think, well, maybe they're just trying to scare us, maybe this is just, fear-mongering. But now, what people realize is that, after just a few short months of having these right-wing politicians in power, society collapsed in an incredible way, and I think that's something that fed the victory of the left just a few weeks ago.
You were talking, Ollie, about the economic kind of decimation of working people under the Áñez government after the removal or after the resignation of Evo Morales in Bolivia. And one of the things that you mentioned kind of in passing, but I didn't want to let go unemphasized, is that these right-wing economic policies of privatization, of selling nationalized industries to multinational corporations, of cutting public welfare programs, of austerity politics, that was destroying the economy before the pandemic. You know, I don't want our listeners to hear you talking about the economic devastation of the Áñez government, of the right-wing economic policies, and think, oh, well, there was a pandemic, Ollie. There was a pandemic. Of course, there's been a recession in every country across the globe. And it's like, it's very important to recognize that this was happening before the coronavirus hit the world or Bolivia.
Yeah, absolutely. And Luis Arce, who's now the president, he's an economist, and he was warning about this, what was going on months before the pandemic. I had the opportunity to interview him, and he talked about the fact that in Bolivia, what has been the most successful model has been state-led development. Because for big development projects that are required in countries like Bolivia, projects like sort of developing industrial capacity, manufacturing, these are things that are very, very long term. So the free market doesn't see a great deal of importance in them because they don't bring short-term profits, but they do have very large short-term costs. So the state is the only sort of motor that can sort of look long-term and then put the money down. And the decimation of the state industries was incredibly damaging for Bolivia to be able to be going into the pandemic with that going on. Because, in a country like Bolivia, most of the economy, this is true of most of Latin America, that most people work in the informal economy. So that's to say they work, informal trade, things like this. So that economic activity isn't registered, which means isn't taxed. If someone's selling food on the side of a road, the government doesn't know that that's happening, so they can't tax each transaction. So, and on top of that, you have the fact that, the number of rich people in Bolivia or other countries in Latin America, there aren't as many, of course, as in the United States, and they're not as rich as they are in the United States. So you can't just say, well, we need to tax the rich. The only way that a state is able to bring in proper revenue to fund development is by having nationalized industries that are profitable, that can, where those profits can be used, brought into the state, and then used to spend on infrastructure and public services, things like this. So the way in which the state companies fell apart really before the pandemic meant that the state had very little money with which to, support people once the pandemic hit. But I think, of course, everywhere in the world had an economic crisis, is experiencing still an economic crisis because of the pandemic. But I think there's ways to approach it. The way that the Áñez regime approached the pandemic was just to lock people away without any plan for how to support anyone. And small businesses have completely collapsed across the board. People have lost their incomes, and that caused an even deeper economic crisis than they could have been. And the reason they posed a total lockdown so quickly was not because of the pandemic. Well, they did it for political reasons. Bolivia was about to go into an election. There were a huge amount of protests at the time, and they saw it. They took a political advantage of coronavirus to, end any kind of dissent, to sort of lock people at home, stop people protesting. So they're very, very eager. They were too eager to put a a total lockdown when there should have been really a partial lockdown in which some sectors of the economy could have continued working to stop a total crisis. But they saw a chance to sort of impose more authoritarianism, and so they imposed a lockdown that was overly rigid without any plan to support people. That's the worst thing.
Right. Yeah, we've seen, certainly not as bad as in Bolivia, but we've seen a bit of that here in the United States, where we've seen the absolute decimation of small businesses because the Paycheck Protection Program that was passed in Congress in the original relief package was not nearly enough. And at the same time, we've seen profits for big companies like Amazon and Walmart, and the compensation packages of billionaires like the Waltons and Jeff Bezos skyrocket at the same time as just yesterday, the Alabama Department of Labor issued a notice saying that they will begin work search requirements for all people receiving unemployment insurance who are unemployed through no fault of their own because of the pandemic, because there are no jobs. And the Alabama Department of Labor is saying you're going to have to prove that you're looking for a job before you can get unemployment insurance. And so certainly we've seen parts of some similarities, some analogous situations here in the United States that I think people can kind of recognize happening there. We're talking to Thomas Becker, a human rights attorney. Ollie, you'll know him. He told me to tell you, he said hello. We're talking to him about a lot of the, we're going to be talking to him about the human rights violations of the Áñez government, and even some critiques of the Morales government, of which there are some, and there are some legitimate critiques, and I don't think you would disagree with that. But you mentioned the political repression, and you mentioned that there were lots of protests prior to and during, but also prior to the coronavirus pandemic in response to these austerity policies that were being enacted by the Áñez government. And if you could just kind of really quickly give us an overview of some of those human rights violations. I mean, there were massacres, there were arrest warrants put out for labor union leaders. I mean, just kind of talk about some of that.
Yeah, of course. There were, in the first 10 days of the new government, there were 2 massacres, 2 large massacres, and sort of 2 smaller ones. In total, over 30 people were killed during that period. And during that period, what you had was the government, the president, the self-declared president, Áñez, declared a decree that said that all military personnel basically have immunity during this period. So it means that they could commit whatever they wanted and wouldn't be able to face justice for it. So that's obviously a carte blanche to, for executions, for torture. And so I think something that's quite important now is that the new legislature is pushing for charges against all of the ministers that signed that decree, because that was a criminal decree. To put that into law was highly illegal and triggered, huge number of killings and human rights abuses. Some of the other, I should say, after that period of the massacres, there was sort of negotiations with the social movements, and they agreed to end that decree as a sort of peace agreement. What we saw then was just huge persecution. Every kind of labor leader, every prominent leftist was given sort of criminal charges, some arrested, some. I knew some of my own friends that had a left-wing radio show, had arrest warrants put out for them. They had to run off to Argentina. Some of the sort of labor leaders I worked with here in this region in Cochabamba had more than 10 criminal charges stacked against them each, and for things sedition, terrorism, organizing a protest was considered terrorism. Not, calling the government a coup government was considered sedition, and you face charges for this. And that was, the fear that those charges would then translate into an arrest warrant it could have happened any minute of any day, and people had to live with that fear for a whole year. You know, so it's an extraordinarily difficult time. But I think there's, you know, people really feel like there's a weight lifted off them now. And from the moment the election results were declared, people knew that these days had to be over. And in fact, what we saw, quite very, very interestingly, was that the justice system that had been putting out all these arrest warrants and criminal charges, etc., now that once they no longer felt pressured by the coup government, they started lifting a lot of these. They lifted the arrest warrant against Evo Morales, against a lot of his ex-ministers, and this was actually while the coup government was still in power, because there's a short transition power between the election and actually taking power. And it just showed the sort of reign of terror that had been even within the state, within the government sort of infrastructure, that these judges, everyone felt so scared and so pressured to bend to the will of the state that they ended up doing all of this. And then once they no longer felt pressured, once the election results were out, they just started lifting everything. It was quite extraordinary, quite humiliating for these government ministers that have been, sort of going on TV every day and boasting about how they're going to lock people up and they're going on a hunt, to suddenly have, still be in power, but essentially lose it while they're still in the job.
So, Ollie, that's interesting to me what you say about the military. And the question that I pose is, the military is not changing, even though we have Evo Morales coming in. What kind of uphill battle is that going to face? I'm sure that the incoming government will take care of some of these, but it sounds like the military was more than happy to go along with this last plan. So how are they going to address that moving forward?
Well, I think something quite important happened just before the last government and the last sort of session of the legislature. I should say that in 2014, I think I mentioned yesterday, 2014, Evo Morales won with over 60% of the vote. And so the MAS, his party, had more than 2/3 of the seats in the parliament. Now, there's a law in Bolivia that says that important decisions such as changes within the military and the police have to be approved by 2/3 of the Congress. Now, that's a problem for the incoming government because although Luis Arce won a very decisive victory, he didn't win with 2/3. He won with 55%. So the outgoing MAS Congress changed the law to say that now to make these changes, you will only need a simple majority, 50% plus 1. So that means that now the MAS does have the power to make changes within the police and within the military. And it will be very necessary because the whole structure of the military was changed this past year. The Añez government led a massive reorganization to promote the most right-wing and the most corrupt elements within the police and military. So that will certainly have to be reversed. And now the MAS has given itself the power to do it. So, obviously we're still in the first week of the government taking power, but hopefully that's something that will be developed over the next few weeks and months.
So the election of President Luis Arce happened a few weeks ago now, and he's been sworn in. Can you talk to us? Walk us through the election. I saw on folks that are kind of online will know that there's been a deluge of Bolivian Twitter accounts, right, that are saying that in the run up to the election were saying, oh, don't believe the polls, don't believe the polls. Carlos Mesa is going to win. Luis Arce is going to be decimated. The people don't want socialism here, or what, all that kind of stuff. Talk to us about the run up to the election of Arce and what what were people saying that were critical of the election results previously? You know, the election this time was so so lopsided that there's not really much that they could do in terms of allegations of voter fraud. But you know, just talk to us about the run up to the election, and then maybe what are workers in Bolivia looking for from the new MAS administration, from Arce's presidency?
Yeah, I think the polls themselves were quite wrong. The polls showed that the MAS was the largest party, of course, that Luis Arce was the most popular candidate, but there wasn't a single poll that showed him anywhere near 55%. I think the best poll had him to around 46, 47. So they're nearly 10 points out. And the reason for this is the reason that polls underestimate things such as the vote for Brexit or the vote for Trump. And that's because often the pollsters are focused on the big cities or on the people, with the best internet connections, things like this. And they find it hard to reach the rural areas. And so therefore there's a certain sort of, there's a hidden vote there that belongs to the MAS, because the areas that the pollsters can't reach are rural, indigenous areas, and that's where the MAS has the strongest base of support. You know, in remote areas of the highlands, of the Amazonian areas, that's where the MAS is strongest, and that's where the pollsters weren't able to reach. They were focused on the big cities, and so of course there's some people even now that are trying to say that there was electoral fraud because they can't understand it, because they live in middle-class neighborhoods of the 2 or 3 big cities, and everyone they know, they don't know a single person that voted for the MAS. Everyone in their neighborhood hates the MAS, and they're not lying about that. Everyone for 3, 4, 5 blocks that they know hates the MAS because of the socio-economic status of where they live. And I think that's, certainly in the US, I'm sure there's places, sort of big liberal cities, and where there are people who don't know a single Trump voter and don't know anyone for many miles that would support Trump, at least not openly. So they don't understand. They don't understand that the country is wider than just their neighborhood. That the country is wider than just sort of the area of the city. And it comes with a basic problem that the right in Bolivia doesn't understand the character of the country. They don't understand the culture that is imbued in the majority of people, both in the rural areas and in the working class areas of the big cities, because they don't want to. They're sort of repulsed by this culture, so they refuse to learn about it, and therefore they shoot themselves in the foot by the fact that the end result is that they don't understand the country, and then therefore they can't win elections if you don't understand the country. So the Bolivian right is incredibly short-sighted. Despite the fact that they'll show off about having studied at university, they have an incredibly narrow sort of worldview that stops them from understanding the realities of the majority of people in the country. So I think that was very important for the MAS to be able to win with such a margin. And of course, now there's still small sectors of the country that say that there was electoral fraud. Of course, this is cries of desperation, people reaching around for anything, in the same way that Trump in the United States is trying to say that now. But I think it's something to certainly keep an eye on, because although these are very small groups, it was very small groups that protested against Evo Morales last year and were able to, completely throw the country into chaos. So I think we have to be very, very, very vigilant about that.
And one of the biggest problems that you see is when it's the same way in the U.S. leading up to the election and the same way since the election. It don't take a large group to start sowing discord and disbelief in the electoral process, and then that spreads like wildfire. So whether even if you can find just very small, I think one of the Trump lawyers I read yesterday was arguing for 459 possible fraud votes in Pennsylvania. And when the judge asked him if he was indeed alleging fraud, he said, "No, we're not alleging fraud." But it shows that it opens the door up for all of the supporters to start saying, "Oh, well, then the election is rigged," and that opens the door up for many years.
Right.
Lost.
Yeah, and of course, once you got that, then you got a justification to start bringing violence to the streets and start destabilizing the country. So it's the whole process last year took 21 days exactly from the moment the protest started to the moment of the coup. So in 21 days, they took Bolivia from a peaceful country into a country in total disarray. So the groups at the moment are very, very small, smaller than last year. But certainly, I think the world should keep an eye on that, and shouldn't. I really hope that we don't see sort of editorials in the New York Times or liberal commentators talking about oh well, you look at the Bolivian people, they're protesting against Luis Arce or the MAS or something. No, these are very, very tiny groups based in the upper and middle class of 2 or 3 big cities.
Mm-hmm. So with the election of President Arce, what are workers and the labor movement and the indigenous groups, what are they looking for from the Arce government? Here in America, Democrats, Joe Biden ran on a orange man bad, get Trump out of office, but there really wasn't a broad agenda that Biden put forward. And I'm assuming it's not that way with the MAS. I'm assuming that there was some kind of broader agenda that they were running on. So what was that, and what are some of the things that the labor movements and the indigenous groups are looking for from the new government?
Well, yeah, you're right. I think the MAS doesn't go into elections with a sort of shopping list of different policies and hoping to win people over individual things like that. The MAS has, first of all, a historical proposal, a sort of general project for how the country should be, which is the main reason most people feel identified with the party. That general project is, the idea that social movements, workers' movements will be able to govern themselves, will be able to participate in the exercise of political power, and important part of that is the nationalization of natural resources, strategic industries, using that to bring, mobilizing that power to engineer economic development. That's the general project that the MAS represents, that's always represented, and which is a historical proposal because it's aimed at fixing historical injustices, injustice that have been around since, for 500 years, since the Spanish first came to Latin America, to end that history of exclusion of the majority of people from political power. That's the historical general project. And of course, in the more immediate terms, people have a short-term memory that, tells them very clearly that a year ago, Bolivia was the fastest growing economy in South America under Evo Morales, and living standards were rising year on year. However, within just 1 year, less than a year, under a right-wing government, all of that came crashing down. So, people, it wasn't 100 years ago. People have that fresh in their minds. People have fresh in their minds how, they could expect a better future for their children, but now suddenly it's not just their children who are unemployed, but they themselves. So there was certainly a section of the vote that was against the right, against the neoliberal right, because of the way in which they completely destroyed what had been built up for 14 years in such little time. So out of that is a key demand of people for there to be an economic recovery, for the government to invest in public infrastructure projects like it was doing before, investing in things like, water programs, infrastructure, roads, Hospitals, obviously, is an important one after the pandemic. So, yeah, what they're expecting is a return to that sort of state-led development that Bolivia was on for 14 years and which was interrupted for the past year.
I've got one more question. David, do you have any questions before we let Ollie go?
I would just say, yeah, one last question, and you know, it's going to be an assumption, but how do you? I know Arce was kind of handpicked by Morales. Do you feel like they're going to get the long shopping list, as you described it, of what they want out of this new administration?
Well, I think the MAS is more than, I think as I said yesterday, it's not a traditional political party. It's a coalition of different movements. So each section of that movement, of course, has its sort of sectoral demands, you could say. At the same time, those movements know that, you know, the MAS is not just a vehicle for purely sectoral demands, for purely getting, you know, the project that you want for your particular section of people. But there does have to be a kind of wider consideration as well. But yeah, I think there's, we've seen in the past few days, and the people they've appointed to the ministries, to the sort of vice ministries, a lot of them have been, most of the leaders of the social movements that form the MAS are now ministers within the government. In fact, the largest indigenous group is called the Interculturales, and their leader is now the head of the Bolivian highway agency. So he'll determine where there should be building roads, infrastructure, and of course he has an understanding of where, you know, people's needs are, and where, particularly for rural indigenous people, you know, the importance of building roads, the importance of where they need to go. So I think there's always a quite interesting relationship between social movements and political power. But yeah, I think there's always been a constructive engagement. Sometimes people don't get exactly, you know, everything they want. I think those who come into the MAS wanting it to be just a vehicle for them to take money from the state for their particular community and projects end up not getting what they want. But I think where, you know, a particular sector proposes something which goes along with a general plan of development that the government has, is something that is likely to go ahead.
So my final question is, you know, it struck me, and I mentioned this yesterday, talking to the 30-year member of the Coca Growers Union, you know, kind of how deeply the MAS has built trust with the working people, rural and indigenous groups in Bolivia. And, you know, David and I really kind of push less towards electoral politics and more towards the labor movement, partially because of where we are in Alabama. You know, there's very kind of few electoral prospects for a left, so to speak, or a worker-centered electoral movement here. Also because it's immediate, it's more empowering than electoral politics in our estimation. But insofar as electoral politics go, here in Alabama, the Democratic Party, which is ostensibly supposed to be the worker-centered party, has been decimated. 60% of Alabamians who make less than $50,000 a year voted for the Republican Party. And so, you know, what advice would you have to people looking to build trust among, you know, rural and working Alabamians, that you know, a worker-centered party is actually going to fight for them, and that they should trust the you know, that they should trust them, or that they should trust the labor movement, or that they should be a part of these movements? What are some lessons that folks like David and myself and folks that are in the Democratic Party can take from the MAS in Bolivia?
there's so many lessons I think that Bolivia can take to the world, but I think the MAS as a political movement has always been built on the formula of combining social struggle, labor struggle, with the electoral struggle, with electoral participation. But one had to come before the other. You can't just say, oh, we'll marry both together if you don't have a labor movement, if you don't have social struggle. There was 30 years of social struggle without real political representation before that social struggle was strong enough to be able to articulate itself politically and build a political instrument. And I think when it's just, when the time comes when the social movement, social struggle is strong enough to be able to impose itself in politics, it shouldn't settle for, supporting a party that will speak on its behalf, that will promise to represent it in Congress or in power. It should be an instrument that is built out of the social movements itself as an instrument, as a way for labor struggle, social struggle to insert itself in politics on its own terms, to govern itself, rather than waiting for others to represent it. I think that's how the MAS is governed. That's why it has the trust of people, because people don't see, MAS officials coming down from on high asking, oh, if you vote for us, we'll represent you. No, people understand that it's my party, it's our party. Through my participation in my unions and things, I am the party. So I think that organic link with people is the only reason that the MAS has been around for now nearly 2 decades. Right. Every election they change parties, they change the name of their parties. They're always called something very generic, like Together, or the Civic Party, or the We Believe, things like this, things that don't mean anything, because they're just like shell companies essentially for different interests and different opportunists. The MAS is the only party that stood in every election for the past 20 years, because it has a root amongst ordinary people. And that's the most important thing.
See, that is the most brilliant comment that I've heard out of anybody, because that is the single, in my opinion, the single most important problem that we face, not just in Alabama, but in the entire nation, is we have a large group of elitists that run for the Democratic Party and have no concept of what the struggle is in rural areas and places like that. And something that I've been pushing for is for the actual labor movement to begin running for office and to begin taking control over these parties and quit allowing this savior to come in and save us consistently, because they're not saving us. They're enriching their friends.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I knew David was going to like that answer.
I mean, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. Yeah. But it's work. But the reason that I like it is because it is actually working. Mm-hmm. There's a place that you can point to and say, look, it's working for them.
Right. All right. Ollie, thanks so much. I really enjoyed the conversation. Yep. Thanks so much for taking time with us. We really appreciate it. Looking forward to our audience hearing this. We'll let you know when it goes live, and we've got it on YouTube. Where can people find you if they want to read your work?
Well, I work at a radio station called Radio Kawsachun it's in Bolivia, but without that, we built an English language sort of service. It's called Kawsachun News. We're on Twitter at Kawsachun News, and on Facebook as well. We hope to be expanding that even further, building a website, working on a number of different projects. So yeah, definitely keep a lookout for that.
Repeat that one more time, Ollie, because you were kind of breaking up with your bandwidth on there.
Oh, sorry. Kawsachun News. That's a Quechua word. Combined it with news. I can put it into. I can send it to you guys. Maybe we can put it as part of the post or something. But yeah, it's an English. We built it as an English language page to tell people what's going on in Bolivia. I think we're the only ones doing it. So yeah, hopefully we can project ourselves and get support around the world.
All right, Ollie, thanks so much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
All right.